In war, refusing an order can cost more than your life. On a frozen Korean ridge, under a sky lit by distant artillery, a Chinese field commander faced a choice that would define his career, and possibly his fate. The directive was clear: advance and seize the position before dawn. But across the valley stood a heavily fortified Canadian defensive line. Disciplined, entrenched, and prepared, the general knew what a frontal assault would mean. Heavy losses, little gain. And so he hesitated. In that hesitation lay a question more powerful than gunfire. Is obedience always the same as duty? If you value cinematic, balanced, and deeply researched history storytelling, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps keep powerful history alive. By the later stages of the Korean War, momentum had slowed into a grinding stalemate. What had once been sweeping offensives became calculated. Battles over ridgelines and trenches. Every hill mattered. Every decision carried weight beyond the immediate battlefield. Canadian forces, integrated within United Nations command structures, had established defensive sectors known for organization and discipline. Their trench systems were reinforced against artillery. Machine gun nests overlapped in carefully measured arcs. Mortar teams pre-registered likely approach routes. Communication lines were checked repeatedly through the night. These were not symbolic defenses. They were engineered ones. Opposing them were Chinese forces seasoned by earlier campaigns. They had demonstrated remarkable effectiveness in maneuver, warfare, and surprise offensives, particularly during the earlier phases of the conflict. But as the war matured into fortified lines and hardened positions, tactics required adjustment. A direct assault against a well-prepared ridge meant advancing uphill under observation. It meant crossing ground already mapped by enemy artillery observers. It meant confronting defenders who had rehearsed response drills countless times. For a field commander, this was not merely a question of bravery. It was mathematics. Reports from reconnaissance units suggested the Canadian position had recently strengthened. Its wire obstacles and extended trench depth along reverse slopes. Artillery coordination appeared swift. Previous probing attempts in similar sectors had been met with immediate defensive flares and concentrated fire. The order to attack had come from higher headquarters, where broader operational goals shaped decisions. Pressure along the front was necessary to maintain initiative. Demonstrating offensive posture mattered strategically. Yet battlefield leadership demanded situational awareness. The commander studied his maps. Elevation lines curved sharply upward toward the Canadian ridge. The valley floor offered minimal cover. Weather conditions were clear, meaning movement under moonlight would likely be detected. Launching an assault under those conditions risked severe casualties without guaranteed success. Refusing or delaying such an order was not a small matter. Military command structures rely on discipline. Hesitation can be interpreted as insubordination. Consequences for failure to act could include court-martial or severe professional penalty. But so could failure in battle. Inside his command post, lit dimly to avoid detection, the general weighed two forms of risk: immediate obedience that might cost hundreds of lives, or calculated delay that could cost his career. War often forces leaders into impossible balances. Across the valley, Canadian soldiers maintained their routines, unaware of the debate unfolding in the opposing command sector. Sentries rotated quietly. Listening posts monitored for movement. Artillery observers reviewed coordinates once more before midnight. They expected action. But no full assault came that night. Instead, limited probing movements tested the defensive perimeter. Defensive flares illuminated the slope instantly. Machine gun fire swept pre-registered lanes. Mortars responded with precise timing. The probing force withdrew quickly. Having confirmed what intelligence suggested, the ridge was prepared. Back in the command post, the general understood that a full-scale attack under identical conditions would likely meet the same rapid resistance, amplified. The war at this stage had become less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about endurance, leverage, and preservation of manpower. Armistice discussions, though fragile, had begun intermittently. Every casualty influenced morale and negotiation strength. Preserving experienced soldiers for more Favorable conditions could serve the larger objective more effectively than forcing an assault for symbolic compliance. The commander drafted a revised operational plan, recommending artillery, harassment and pressure in a neighboring sector where terrain offered marginal concealment advantages. It was not refusal, it was redirection. Whether higher command would accept that adjustment remained uncertain. In the silence of the frozen hills, discipline held on both sides. History often remembers charges and explosions, but sometimes, the most powerful moment in war is when a leader chooses caution over impulse, knowing the personal cost that choice might bring. The message to higher headquarters was sent before dawn. It was carefully worded. Not defiant, not emotional, but precise. The terrain offered limited cover. The defensive works appeared recently reinforced. Artillery response times suggested strong coordination. A frontal assault under current conditions, the commander advised, would likely result in disproportionate losses relative to achievable ground. In war, language can determine survival as much as tactics. Hours passed without reply. Inside the command bunker, tension built quietly. Junior officers reviewed contingency plans in silence. Runners waited near the entrance, boots dusted with frost. Outside, soldiers prepared equipment as if an attack were inevitable. Helmets adjusted, ammunition counted, letters tucked into inner pockets. No one spoke openly about the risk hovering over their commander's decision, but they understood the stakes. Military culture depends on obedience. A commander who questions an order walks a narrow path. By mid-morning, a response arrived. Higher command reiterated the importance of maintaining pressure along the front. However, it stopped short of demanding immediate assault. It requested further reconnaissance and authorized limited tactical discretion based on field assessment. The general exhaled slowly. This was not full endorsement, but it was space to maneuver strategically without openly contradicting directive intent. Across the valley, Canadian units remained alert. Artillery observers scanned the lower slopes through rangefinders. Intelligence officers compiled patrol reports from the previous night's probing action. Defensive commanders suspected that the limited contact was more than random harassment. It felt like measurement, and measurement meant planning. The Canadian Ridge had become a fixed anchor within a fluid front. Its trench systems zigzagged carefully along elevation lines. Reverse slopes concealed mortar pits. Communication trenches allowed movement without exposure. Every defensive element reflected experience earned over months of engagement. They were not invulnerable, but they were organized. The Chinese commander knew that breaking such a position required coordination beyond mere courage. It demanded synchronized artillery preparation, diversionary attacks, precise timing, and favorable weather conditions. None of those factors aligned that week. Meanwhile, intelligence from southern sectors indicated thinner trench networks and slightly slower counter-battery response. Terrain there included broken gullies that offered intermittent concealment during approach. He redirected attention south. Artillery units were repositioned gradually under cover of darkness. Reconnaissance patrols intensified mapping of the alternative sector. Communication lines were extended quietly. The objective had not changed. Pressure would still be applied, but it would be applied where probability favored sustainability. Yet even as operations shifted, the shadow of potential court-martial lingered. If results failed to justify deviation from initial expectations, accountability would fall on him. Military institutions value outcomes. Tactical caution must prove its merit. Over the following nights, limited engagements erupted along the southern ridgeline. Artillery thundered across valleys. Infantry advanced in controlled formations, testing weak points rather than charging fortified peaks. Progress was incremental. Meters gained, positions contested, then consolidated. Losses occurred, but not at catastrophic scale. On the Canadian-held ridge, soldiers heard the distant escalation. The thunder of guns echoed from beyond their immediate sector. Patrol reports confirmed increased activity further south. Officers interpreted the pattern quickly. The focus had shifted. Yet vigilance remained unchanged. Defensive readiness does not relax simply because pressure moves elsewhere. Rotations continued. Listening posts remained active. Machine gun crews rehearsed firing arcs once more. They understood something essential. In stalemate warfare, today's quiet ridge can become tomorrow's focal point. For the Chinese commander, reports from the southern operation showed modest gains. Not decisive breakthroughs, but stable advancement under manageable cost. Headquarters responded with measured approval. The broader operational picture benefited from diversified pressure rather than singular concentration. The feared disciplinary consequences did not materialize. His earlier hesitation, once heavy with risk, became validated by outcome. It had not been refusal. It had been adaptation. War often forces leaders into stark moral dilemmas. Yet sometimes the most difficult choice is not between action and inaction, but between immediate compliance and strategic patience. Had he ordered the frontal assault against the prepared Canadian ridge, the battle might have erupted in dramatic intensity. Casualties could have mounted quickly. Against layered defenses and coordinated artillery, the ridge might have changed hands temporarily, or not at all. Instead, strength was preserved for engagements with more favorable conditions. On both sides of the valley, soldiers endured the same cold, the same uncertainty, the same relentless tension of static warfare. They did not know the calculations made above them. They only knew their tasks: to hold, to observe, to advance when ordered. The frozen hills had become less about dramatic conquest and more about endurance. And endurance rewards leaders who understand that preserving lives can serve strategy better than sacrificing them for appearances. As the days passed, the southern sector grew louder. Artillery exchanges rolled across the hills in long, echoing waves. Smoke drifted through valleys that had once been silent. Infantry units moved cautiously between shattered tree lines and frozen gullies, advancing not in reckless surges, but in controlled, deliberate steps. Each meter gained was secured, reinforced, and mapped. In the northern sector, where the Canadian ridge stood, something unusual settled over the battlefield. Stillness, not peace, but restraint. Canadian officers monitored the shifting pattern carefully. Reports from Allied intelligence confirmed heavier contact south of their position. Patrols observed fewer reconnaissance movements across their own valley. The anticipated full assault had not returned, yet the ridge remained alert. Machine gun crews maintained overlapping arcs of fire. Mortar teams recalibrated coordinates weekly. Artillery observers tracked distant flashes, calculating direction and distance. Defensive discipline is not built for glory. It is built for consistency. Across the line, the Chinese commander studied situation reports from both sectors. The southern engagement produced measured, sustainable progress. Casualty numbers, though never insignificant, remained within projected limits. Supply lines were stable. Morale held steady. His earlier decision, once shadowed by the possibility of punishment, was now quietly reinforced by results. But leadership in wartime is rarely free of pressure. Higher headquarters sent evaluative communications, requesting clarification of long-term objectives. Strategic initiative had to be maintained. Every sector needed to demonstrate momentum. Even limited gains had to be framed within broader operational goals. The commander understood that preserving manpower alone was not enough. He needed to show that his discretion produced tangible value. He expanded reconnaissance efforts along secondary ridges, identifying terrain that offered partial concealment from artillery observation. Engineers were instructed to improve forward approach routes discreetly. Supply movements were staggered to reduce detectability. He was not avoiding combat. He was shaping it. On the Canadian ridge, winter winds intensified. Snow gathered in trench corners. Soldiers reinforced bunker roofs against ice buildup. Letters from home circulated quietly between shifts. Even in stalemate, life continued in fragments. Shared rations, quiet jokes, careful watch rotations. They did not know that their preparedness had altered enemy planning. They only knew that vigilance was survival. Occasional artillery shells still landed near their positions, sporadic reminders that the war had not forgotten them. But no coordinated mass assault emerged. Military history often simplifies moments like these into binary narratives. Bravery versus fear, advance versus retreat. In reality, seasoned commanders operate within layers of complexity. Orders must be interpreted through terrain, timing, and capability. The Chinese commander's hesitation was not defiance. It was calculation. And calculation requires courage of a different kind. Weeks into the adjusted strategy, operational summaries revealed an important outcome. Forces preserved from the abandoned frontal. Assault remained available for sustained engagement elsewhere. Unit cohesion remained intact. Experienced officers continued leading rather than being replaced. In prolonged conflict, experience is a strategic asset. Meanwhile, diplomatic discussions regarding armistice conditions continued intermittently. Though fragile and uncertain, they signaled a shifting horizon. Every preserved unit, every stable defensive line, influenced negotiation posture. The frozen hills were no longer arenas of sweeping conquest. They were bargaining positions shaped by endurance. The commander reflected privately on the night. He chose redirection over direct assault. He understood how easily the story could have unfolded differently. A single impulsive decision might have filled casualty lists and weakened operational flexibility. Instead, restraint had strengthened his sector's longevity. Across the valley, Canadian forces maintained readiness without knowing they had been spared a major engagement. Their discipline remained constant, training drills repeated, defensive improvements continued. In war, preparedness must assume that tomorrow will test it again, and perhaps it would. But for that moment, the ridge stood as a silent testament to something rarely acknowledged in combat narratives: the power of measured judgment. In the end, warfare is not sustained by aggression alone. It is sustained by leaders who recognize when conditions favor action, and when they demand patience. The snow-covered battlefield did not record the internal debate that prevented a costly assault. No monument marked the decision. No headline celebrated restraint. Yet hundreds of soldiers continued to serve because one commander weighed obedience against outcome and chose adaptation. By the time winter began to loosen its grip on the Korean hills, the front lines looked almost unchanged on a map. The same ridges, the same valleys, the same contour lines that had been studied under lantern light weeks earlier. But beneath that apparent stillness, something significant had unfolded. The southern sector, where pressure had been redirected, stabilized after weeks of controlled engagement. Gains were modest but defensible. Positions captured were reinforced quickly, supply routes secured, artillery observation posts established. The advance did not produce dramatic headlines. It produced leverage. And leverage, in a war increasingly defined by negotiation, mattered. In the northern sector, the Canadian-held ridge remained firmly in place. Its trench lines deepened, timber supports were replaced, communication wires were buried more carefully. Defensive routines continued with professional precision. The soldiers stationed there endured cold nights, sporadic shelling, and the constant strain of anticipation, never knowing how close they had come to facing a full-scale assault. Across the valley, the Chinese commander reviewed updated operational summaries. Casualty reports were steady but sustainable. Unit cohesion remained strong. Experienced non-commissioned officers still led their squads. Equipment losses were within replacement capacity. Most importantly, his forces were intact. The earlier fear that hesitation might lead to court-martial gradually dissolved. Headquarters communications shifted tone. Reports praised efficient resource management and tactical flexibility. The emphasis was no longer on immediate frontal breakthroughs, but on maintaining operational balance across sectors. The war had matured. By 1953, armistice negotiations intensified. Though fragile and often stalled, they reflected a broader reality. Neither side could achieve decisive victory without unacceptable cost. The battlefield had become a place where endurance shaped diplomacy. The commander understood something essential. Leadership in war is not measured only by how fiercely one attacks, but by how responsibly one preserves strength. Every soldier committed to a hopeless assault represents not only a life at risk, but future capability diminished. His decision that frozen night had not been an act of fear. It had been an act of judgment. On the Canadian Ridge, soldiers rotated home months later, replaced by fresh units who inherited the same trenches and the same watch schedules. The ridge remained contested territory in theory, but in practice it stood as part of a stabilized line that would eventually define the demilitarized zone. History often remembers the battles that explode in fire and smoke. It rarely pauses to consider the battles that never begin. Yet sometimes, what does not happen carries equal weight. Had the assault been launched, the valley might have witnessed heavy losses beneath concentrated defensive fire. Artillery would have thundered relentlessly. Casualty lists would have lengthened. The ridge might have changed hands, briefly, or remained where it stood, but at significant cost. Instead, strategy prevailed over impulse. The frozen landscape became a chessboard where moves were deliberate, not dramatic. Feints tested reactions. Pressure shifted where opportunity existed. Strength was preserved for moments when terrain and timing aligned. For the commander, the lesson endured long after the guns quieted. Obedience must serve purpose. Courage must be guided by calculation. And sometimes, the most difficult order to give is the one that restrains rather than commands advance. When the armistice was finally signed in July 1953, it froze the conflict near the lines where so many of these decisions had unfolded. The Korean peninsula remained divided. The ridges remained etched with memory. But countless soldiers returned home because certain assaults were reconsidered. The story of that winter ridge is not one of spectacle. It is one of responsibility. War demands bravery from those who charge forward. It demands something equally rare from those who decide when not to. In the silence between artillery exchanges, in the pause before dawn, a commander chose to weigh cost against outcome. That choice did not erase conflict. It did not end the war, but it shaped it. And in the harsh mathematics of history, that can be enough.